as inaugural winners of the 2040 prize, there's much I want to ask you about your books, of course, but I'm curious about why you were drawn to the form of the short novel or long story.
Oh, absolutely. I think there's something about the novella that means you can both read it very quickly and also take your time to absorb what's going on. You get much more meat on the bones than you would with a short story that, you know, tends to be a bit of a slice of time or a series of slices of time, but you don't go down the rabbit holes of subplots. You know, generally you're in a discrete story world that's going to take you somewhere that you can enjoy, usually in one or two reading pieces. But in terms of writing them, I feel a little bit the same way, in that, you know, writing a novel is such a huge undertaking, or for me it is anyway. But with a novella, once it presents itself as a novella, usually very early on in the writing process, I'm really excited because I've got that sort of, I can almost see the finish line, you know, from very early on in the writing process, which excites me. I write faster. I finish that draft. You know, as I was saying to Rebecca yesterday, it's like flying without the fear of having the aeroplane. It's a wonderful feeling and incredibly satisfying.
A lot of what Kim has said is the same thing that appeals to me as a reader and a writer. But I think what I like about novellas is that complexity that you can develop, and yet you still have that sense of fleetingness, partly because perhaps, as Kim said, you know, you're sitting down, you can read it in 1 or 2 sessions, but there is something about it that is both complete and fleeting. And a lot of the reading and the writing that I most enjoy is writing that captures that sense of a moment in time, taking a breath, a mood, something that you just want to capture, but you have enough space, unlike in a short story, to explore it and to have some room for introspection. That's what I most love about it as a writer and a reader. And it took me a long time to figure out that the characters I was working with and the story that was coming to me was actually more of a novella. And when that occurred in my head, it was like, everything fit into place. The whole story just kind of fell into place. So it felt like a very natural structure or form.
So moving closer to the stories you tell in these wonderful books, I'm interested to tease out the sense that both books have, that they're very strong, engaging stories about transitions from childhood to adulthood. Being a young person who's immersed in the world without reflection so much on your place in it, to the sudden realization of your place in it.
It is a coming of age story. It's told through Frankie's eyes, but the story she tells is the story of her sister as well as herself. And they are both struggling at different ages, of course, but actually they're both struggling with exactly what you were talking about, Julian, that transition from, not from childhood, but from adolescence into, well, both adulthood and becoming a woman, because those are two separate things, really. And I mean in an emotional sense and in a physical sense. Justine's struggle, because she's anorexic, has a very strong physical element to it, but behind every person who has an eating disorder, the hunger acts as a metaphor. So she is also struggling with, you know, emotions and things that she's going to find more difficult as an adult. And I wanted, I think, to step outside Justine's mind and observe it from a younger person's mind, a younger person who has less understanding of what's going on and is less involved. So what we see through Frankie's eyes as a 14-year-old is what happens to Justine and what she says, but not what she's feeling, and it's an enigma. I think that Frankie looks to her older sister for an example of how to grow up, because she herself is trying to find her way through and struggling through adolescence, but what she sees is a role model who is perhaps struggling even more than her. It's a flawed role model, I guess. And she has to make her own way, her own transition into adulthood. And that's really what the story's about, if that makes sense.
Yes, but it's also enabled by the older Frankie being present too, looking
Yes.
at the younger Frankie. So
Yes.
it's not just an adolescent view, it's an older woman's view of her own life and her sister's life. And Kim, coming to you, I mean, the interesting thing about your central protagonists, Clorinda and Dottie, is that they're not adolescents, but in some ways they've been protected from the reality of life by their circumstance. So they're perhaps confronting reality at a slightly older age, but being made to grow up at the same time, perhaps.
Yes, Dottie and Clorinda in Ladies' Rest and Writing Room are both around about the age of 21, and the story takes place in 1922 as Australia is kind of crawling out from under the despair of the fallout from the First World War. It's no mistake that they're sort of moving from adolescence into some form of adulthood, as the nation was at the time. That was quite a deliberate choice. The characters are very cloistered in their middle-class world, but at the same time, because of their experiences of the First World War, of being young women left at home, they've experienced this kind of trauma at a remove throughout the war during their adolescence, and now coming to terms with the fallout from that and the tragedies that both of them have experienced. That complicates their transition into adulthood and confuses them in all kinds of ways, particularly emotionally. So they have quite complex and rocky roads to traverse until they find a kind of a refuge in each other that is not necessarily a safe one either.
There are social norms or expectations or ideals that the lives of the central characters, protagonists in the story, are thrown out of in some way. And I wonder if how you feel that's true in your story, particularly about the way your central characters revolve around their sexuality.
One of the things that struck me was that Dottie and Clorinda, being quite cloistered middle-class girls, don't have any kind of language for their feelings. In researching the kinds of exposure that they would have had to same-sex feelings, I just couldn't find anything. And even in the research from queer historians, I couldn't find anything that girls like them could have gone, that's me, or I have those feelings. There was no reflections for them to hang on to. So that it was really interesting to explore it in that way, that they're both really feeling their way without language. But on reflecting on what it was like for me in the 1980s, I felt in a strange way that I didn't have language either. Like a lot of kids who don't necessarily fit the boxes, I kind of knew what bisexuality was. I certainly knew what being gay or lesbian was, but I didn't feel that I belonged there because I didn't have any kind of confidence. So when I thought about who a queer person was, I looked at the confident person who was very articulate about their identity. And so it was, well, I don't really belong there either. So it was really interesting for me to explore a time where there was no language and being able to explore my own feelings.
I was thinking as you were talking, Kim, it's so true that whereas Clorinda and Dottie don't have the language, Frankie, who is a 14-year-old in 1985, has the language, and yet the language doesn't work for her. Like she, and this is a very small element of the story. I don't explore it a great deal, and mostly Frankie reflects on it as in her adult voice rather than at the time. But she remarks at one point that in the year following, she gets an overwhelming crush on a girl in her class. And she knows with her 1980s sensibility that it's okay to like a girl. Like that's what everybody says. It's okay to like a girl. But it doesn't feel okay to her, because what the word okay doesn't encompass is what's normal, what's conformity about, what's acceptance about, what does it actually mean to be okay, what does it mean to like a girl. those things, the words, the language doesn't speak to her at all. At the same time as she's exploring that side of her sexuality, I think she sees in Justine a very disordered sexuality. Justine spends many years lost in a wilderness of anorexia, up and down, because this isn't a recovery story. So it's not a story with a neat, happy ending about someone going into hospital and having treatment for their eating disorder and coming out the other end better. That's not what happens. And that's not what happens for most people. I wanted to portray something about people with anorexia that often isn't talked about. Our stereotypical image of someone who is experiencing anorexia is someone who has starved themselves to put a false constraint on growing up, to stop being a sexual being, to stop, for many people if they are women, to stop being a woman, to reduce their body back to a slightly more, I'm saying this with quotation marks, but an innocent embodiment. But that's not what happens with Justine. She is, during some years of quite extreme emaciation, she's very sexually active. And without discussing that in great deal, I wanted to make a reference to the fact that people use their bodies in many ways to harm themselves.
Talking about your book, Kim, I mean, the judging panel was impressed by the very tangible sense of time and place in your book, even though, of course, you can't have lived there. But you wore the book wears its research quite lightly. And I suppose the question is, what drew you to that particular time?
Early 20th century Sydney is kind of a place that fascinates me, basically because it was my grandparents' Sydney. So I'm drawn to what they might have experienced. Certainly Farmer's Department Store, where the Ladies' Rest and Writing Room resides, is a place of my childhood. My grandmother took me there when I was little. We would go to the fabric sales and, fossick through the remnant tables and things like that during school holidays. So there are those fond memories. But because I work mostly, I write mostly historical fiction, and I love history. I'm a bit of a magpie in terms of Australian social history. I'm often fossicking around the old newspapers on Trove, and I really cannot remember what I was looking for the day that I found the little advertisement for the Ladies' Rest and Writing Room in Farmer's Department Store. This little advertisement dated 1922 in the Sydney Morning Herald, and as soon as I saw it, the first thing I realised was, this is 1922. This is a story about women. Suddenly I'm writing a story about women just from this advertisement. This is a story about women in the wake of World War II. But then when I rested on the description of the Ladies' Rest and Writing Room being, decked out in these rosy shades, I saw this pink refuge, this absolute refuge for women to be together. And immediately it took me back to my own little tender romance at about the age of 20. And I was there with that old friend exploring those things. And pretty much the story wrote itself after that point.
I suppose with you, Rebecca, the connection to the 80s is far more immediate even. But the judging panel was particularly engaged by the focus on the impact of Justine's illness on her family. And that timeless issue of the sense of families and how they're dysfunctional is at the heart of this. But there is also a really strong sense of that time and place and moment, not just a timeless story.
I would have been 15 in 1985. So describing the world through an adolescent's eyes in the 1980s came very instinctively to me. I also have a big love for, one of the promises I made to myself when I first started writing was that Adelaide would always be recognisably Adelaide in any fiction I wrote. The books I love, the books I most love, are embedded in place. And I don't want to have, there's so much I know Australians talk about cultural cringe, but Adelaideans are particularly bad about it. You know, we're this little country town. That's what everybody thinks about us. And I want to bring Adelaide to the world. So 1980s Adelaide is what came to me. And I should just very quickly mention ABBA here, because ABBA's a huge it's a little element in the story, but it's an important element in the story. And while the novel isn't autobiographical, when I was growing up, I had a younger sister. I was actually the older sister of two. Like Justine and Frankie, I could literally sing to you every song in there, like literally every song. I know all their lyrics. They're part of my childhood. They're part of the person who I became, and you got to love what's also embarrassing. So,
to finish, both of you, I have to ask about the 2040 prize as an idea.
This experience, if I can go first, has been wonderfully collaborative and collegial. It's been an experience like no other. I work in Australian publishing, have done for 27 years, and I've, published a few books in the past, but I have never had such a nourishing experience as working with you, and I'm sure that Rebecca feels the same. And the way that you have encouraged Rebecca and I to have a relationship with this experience, inside this experience, is just wonderful. So it feels like a win on so many levels. And the only other thing that I would really love to say about it is that thank you to the judges for choosing two stories about vulnerable young women. That just makes my heart sing. So often, as a woman writer, writing about relationships, writing about concepts of, love and our emotional lives, we're often, sort of put in the box of, women's fiction. We're made to feel that our stories don't quite have the literary worth or heft of some other kinds of narratives. So my heart will be full forever, thanks to the judge's choice of not just my book, but Rebecca's as well. It's a beautiful thing, unforgettable. So, if there's a message that I want to send to anybody out there who's considering submitting a novella for next year's 2040 prize, absolutely go for it.
I just want to celebrate the fact that there is a prize for a novella on the Australian literary scene now. I'm actually a big believer in prizes. I think they're a fabulous way for someone to submit a manuscript that might otherwise just get left on a slush pile. I've had good experience. That was how I got my first book published. I was the winner of the Verona Award for Unpublished Manuscripts many, many years ago, and that's what enabled me to get published in the first place. I think that there is something very democratic, or there should be. It doesn't always work that way, but in principle, there is a democratic principle behind prizes that allows people's writing, not who they are or why they are or where they are or what money they have, to be recognised just for the strength of their writing and for their story. But, let's face it, the Australian literary scene is small because we're a small country. There are not many opportunities. And Finlay Lloyd Publishing has brought another opportunity into the writing world. And I just think that's hugely exciting and worth celebrating. I'm just immensely grateful for that. And I hope that the 2040 prize goes for many years so that other people get a chance to celebrate it too.
Well, we certainly hope so. We're a small non-profit press, but we will be doing our best to make it live on into the future. On behalf of the judging panel and everyone at Finlay Lloyd, I just want to congratulate you both again on winning the prize, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today.